Jim O'Neill frames it as free market innovation, but it would just be a field day for crony capitalism at the end of the day. And also, I forgot to add one of the other, some of the figures that have inspired, that he's cited as inspiring his views on eliminating efficacy testing, say that the efficacy data should be tested on patients after these drugs are administered to them through biosurveillance, including through digital wearables, and that big pharmaceutical companies, the producers of those products, should be given access to the data so that they can jack up the price, depending on how quote unquote effective the drug is based on this data. And it's also a way to surveil what's going on inside people's bodies, which is eerily reminiscent of things said by people like Yuval Noah Harari, who's, affiliated with the World Economic Forum, talking about the utility, how the next frontier of mass surveillance is to surveil what's going on inside people's bodies. And it's quite disturbing that Palantir has now taken over major functions of HHS, including at the CDC, and other aspects of agency functions. And because of O'Neill's deep ties to both Palantir and Peter Thiel, it's likely that he'll push for a deepening of those ties. And Palantir is really the engine that the mass surveillance state runs on. It's a contractor to every single U.S. intelligence agency, all 18 of them, as well as HHS. And it's currently operating programs within HHS that are trying to use Americans' healthcare data to try and predict when people will get sick before they show symptoms. And one of their programs with the CDC has the potential to push for the declaration of a next pandemic before anyone shows symptoms at all, and pushing for this idea that we don't have to, if in the next pandemic, we don't have to do a blanket lockdown, but based on people's healthcare data, we can decide to lock down specific cities or specific communities based on data they assess from the wastewater and things like that before people show any symptoms. But these are AI algorithms making these decisions. They are not 100% accurate. So under this paradigm, you have the potential for an algorithm that's 70 or 60% accurate to say that this city needs to be locked down based on this data, with really no transparency and no way to fight back, with major implications for the local economy and the freedom of movement for people living there, among other things. And some of the people, again, that are sort of behind Jim O'Neill and in his viewpoints, push for segmenting populations based on this data. So basically, certain populations should be given certain types of drugs, and this is quite a complicated thing when you consider that a lot of Palantir's AI specifically is known to have a very extreme racial bias, and was a major cause for concern when Palantir's Tiberius program was used as part of Operation Warp Speed to decide which populations to vaccinate with the experimental mRNA injections first. And of course, they picked mostly minority communities. So this sort of opens the door to experiment a lot of these drugs that are going to be pushed through in this deregulated paradigm on minorities, which is very, very, very unsettling. When you consider the fact that Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, was recently platformed at the White House to promote, among other things, AI-generated, personalized cancer vaccines using mRNA. He recently said that this type of AI surveillance system would force citizens to be on their best behavior at all times, and is basically a nod to the whole concept of a panopticon, which was originally a prison design. I think first, posited in the 19th century or so. And the idea of it was that prisoners would always be on their best behavior because they were always under the watch of a guard, but they couldn't necessarily, because of how the windows were designed in the guard tower, see if they were being watched or not. But feeling that they were being watched at any given moment would induce obedience. And this is the type of tactic that an authoritarian society would employ, not something that is not a society that's trying to enshrine individual liberty and freedom, which I think a lot of people that voted for Trump were hoping to enshrine that. But frankly, I think a lot of the advancement of, Palantir in particular, And what it's attempting to do with its various contracts in the U.S. government is really a bipartisan thing. Their contracts have expanded and advanced with every successive administration since they were created. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, and likely to do so again, considering a lot of the Palantir adjacent figures. That are in the Trump administration. David Sachs, for example, the crypto AI czar, is a big investor in Palantir. Joe Lonsdale, another Palantir co-founder, has been a very vocal supporter of the president and funded his campaign this cycle. And of course, Peter Thiel's connection to people like JD Vance, who worked at Mithril Capital, which of course is a major investor in Palantir. A lot of this does need to be discussed. And I think if people are concerned about these types of paradigms, they should push for a policy rejection of these things. Even if they like a particular person that has these, what I would argue are conflicts of interest, if you can, as you said earlier, like other things they do or say, and not necessarily like this. And I think, if people are concerned about civil liberty and not turning into some sort of totalitarian hellhole where individual liberty is a distant memory, this type of predictive paradigm needs to be rejected, whether it's about national security or health security. I think it's quite clear that a lot of the big tech oligarchs feel like this is going to be a golden age for them specifically. I think it was pretty telling that at the recent inauguration, a lot of them had front row seats, including those that had been very antagonistic to Trump in previous years, like Jeff Bezos in particular, who owns the Washington Post, which was one of the most vocal mainstream media outlets that was very vocally against Trump. So the fact that they're sort of being welcomed back with open arms is quite interesting. But I think, as I've argued for a few years in my work, Silicon Valley and the national security state have essentially fused. You could argue that these big tech oligarchs have more influence over our government than any elected politician because of how dependent the government is on them for their services, whether that's Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, or any of these other companies that are becoming increasingly entangled with the US government, like Palantir that I mentioned earlier. A lot of the essential functions of the government are dependent on these big tech companies now. And they, are trying to, I think, push for a new era of quote unquote innovation and things like AI and things like that, but that would necessarily necessitate greater AI adoption. And so, some of these entities that developed the AI roadmap for the United States, like the National Security Commission on AI, was saying in 2019 that, in-person shopping needs to be eliminated. Facial recognition needs to be more widespread on American streets. Basically, we have to forcibly expand the user base for all of this AI technology. And the best way to do that is through government policy. And so a lot of these announcements, for example, with Stargate and their AI data centers, the teaming up of, OpenAI now becoming a major government contractor, and, Sam Altman saying we need to rewrite the social contract as a consequence of the impacts AI will have on society, and things of that nature. And how Palantir is basically becoming one of the AI engines on which, society, not just the public sector, but also a lot of the private sector is now running. A lot of these oligarchs have outsized influence on our world. And maybe Bill Gates isn't, chairman of Microsoft anymore, but he certainly has a lot of influence in the big tech scene. He's a major investor in a lot of infrastructure companies through his various investment firms. And a lot of those investments, of course, had been made in biotechnology. He made a massive amount of money off of vaccines, particularly in the COVID era. The US government has never stopped funding one of his brain children, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. We give them billions and billions of dollars, and have ever since they were created. And they're one of the biggest funders of the World Health Organization, for example. So even though Trump exited from the WHO, we are still funding, organizations that partner with the WHO and fund the WHO. Bill Gates funds the WHO, I'm pretty sure, directly as an individual through his foundation.
Yes,
and
he
so
does,
sort
yeah.
of cozying up to him. Yeah. So I think cozying up to him, is problematic in a lot of ways, and the fact that he in particular was so enthusiastic after his conversation with Trump about how there would be some sort of acceleration of vaccine innovation similar to what happened in 2020, which is presumably a reference to Operation Warp Speed and the emergency use authorization paradigm. I would argue that that seems to be Bill Gates signaling that there's enthusiasm on the part of the current administration to allow a lot of these mRNA products onto the market. But as we knew during COVID, and also as is still apparent, a lot of these mRNA products under the current regulatory paradigm cannot even make it through animal trials. So there would have to be a great reduction in the rigor of clinical testing, which is already arguably ridden with conflicts of interest depending on the contractor doing that testing. And you could argue that some of those tests aren't rigorous enough, or there's also a revolving door with, those agencies and big pharma, things like that. I think, people need to be very concerned about mRNA technology, and that we shouldn't necessarily be hoping that the government, even with this administration, will save us from it. I think the best we can probably, or something we can probably push for and hopefully get, is that products with mRNA in them, whether that's livestock, meat from livestock injected with mRNA, or other products that have mRNA, are labeled as containing genetic material so people can make informed consent. But I think it's pretty clear that this administration plans to allow those products onto the market, and not to really push for them to be removed, or to have them undergo more rigorous testing. It seems to be quite the opposite. And this is actually, unfortunately, consistent with things that happened with Trump's first term. Not necessarily, well, of course, it happened with pharmaceuticals under the guise of COVID-19, but also the biotech industry was dramatically deregulated in agriculture, and genetic modified organisms had it was a huge market swing in the upwards direction for them under Trump. And actually a lot of organic farmer associations and small farmer associations sued the first Trump administration because of that extreme deregulation of GMOs in the food supply. So, it seems like, at least as far as President Trump is concerned, he doesn't see these, genetically engineered products, whether in the food supply or in the healthcare system, as concerning. And I think, people have sort of tried to explain away his support for the vaccines produced in Operation Warp Speed, and say he doesn't necessarily feel that way. But I think we should pay attention to his own words. And he's continued to sort of, praise it as a great accomplishment. And hasn't really said anything about mRNA needs to be studied, or we're not sure about this. It seems like he's all on board, as of course are the big business leaders in big pharma, which I know Max Jones a month or two ago was on your show to talk about the issue of big pharma and patent cliffs. Really, the only way big pharma can stay alive and continue to expand its profits, as it is wont to do, is to get biotech deregulated so it can flood the product with markets that never have to necessarily go generic and mean that loss of profit, for big pharma, because they'll be in a different category than a lot of existing drugs that are exclusive to a pharmaceutical company and then later go generic. And that creates a big profit dip for these firms. But a lot of these biotechnology things won't be subject to that. And because they're sort of running out of conventional products to market and produce that can make it through regulation, this has been the big push. And they're joined in doing so through a lot of joint ventures with some of the big tech firms, like GlaxoSmithKline, for example, has a joint venture with Google. And there's a lot of these that have been popping up over the years. So, if you have Silicon Valley having an outside influence on this administration, that could very possibly be a motivator here as well. And a lot of the big venture capital firms that are responsible for the rise of the big Silicon Valley behemoths, or have been produced from them, are among the biggest investors in the biotechnology industry. And so I think, people that are concerned about this technology need to be very focused on how these policy agendas progress, and try and do all we can to have informed consent about what products contain them, so that if you wish not to consume them, you can do so effectively.